Well, good morning, everyone. How are you doing today? That's good. I'm John Mann, Director of Education for Lakeside, and of course, the theme of this week is artificial intelligence. And for today, we are fortunate that Nelson Rosario is here. Nelson is a tech lawyer and founder of Rosario Tech Law, LLC, a boutique law firm focused on working with clients dealing with emerging technologies that are changing the way we think about privacy, property, and power. Nelson is also an adjunct law professor, and he has been quoted in the New York Times, TechCrunch, Law 360, and other publications. In addition to being a regular speaker on legal issues raised by emerging technological topics, Nelson is an appointee to the Illinois Supreme Court AI Task Force to create recommendations for the use of generative AI in the Illinois courts. Nelson has degrees in computer science, history, and political science. He's licensed to practice law in the state of Illinois and before the United States Patent and Trademark Office. And today's session is how AI is changing the law in the United States. I do ask if you would please mute your cell phone ringers and help me in welcoming Nelson Rosario.
Well, good morning. Oh, okay, we're hot. Good. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here at Lakeside talking to you about how AI is changing the law in the US. I'll give you a little spoiler, not much yet, but that will change eventually here. I really am delighted to be here though. The first time I came to Lakeside was actually in 2006 when my wife and I were dating. She's sitting over there with our two lovely young kids, as well as my in-laws. And I'm a little nervous today because I've never actually given a talk in front of any of them before. So if I'm a little on edge or kind of looking over there, that's what I'm doing. And I've also got a timer going. So despite I'll get feedback, yeah. I know, I told John I was nervous. He said it's a friendly crowd, mostly. So we'll see. But really my goal today is to try and fundamentally demystify artificial intelligence and kind of give you, a broad overview of some of the things that have been happening in this space over the past kind of 2 years, I would say, as well as, reserve a lot of time for questions. I am an adjunct law professor. I've been doing that for 6 years, and I teach a class called Blockchain, Cryptocurrency, and the Law at Chicago Kent, which is associated with Illinois Tech in Chicago, where we live. And I have students come in there from all walks of life. Despite the fact that the class is focused on Bitcoin and emerging technologies, I've found that anybody can learn these things if they're framed appropriately, right? As somebody with a degree in computer science as well as a lawyer, I know that kind of specialists sometimes try and act as a priestly caste in a sense, in that they kind of use jargon and everything else to try and project their importance, but it kind of clouds the issue, I think, especially with emerging technology. So, this is just who I am, as John said, and thank you for the introduction. I'm the founder of Rosario Tech Law. I work with emerging technology companies really all around the world. It's sometimes difficult for me to explain the work that I do for them because they're running into novel legal issues all the time. So I work with some AI companies. I'm trying to work with more. So if anybody has an AI company and wants to talk after the talk, let me know. I'd be happy to chat with you. Always happy to refer out work as well. Most of my business is related to blockchain companies, cryptocurrency companies. I'm involved in a variety of efforts. I love Lakeside. We love the national parks. So that's kind of where I'm coming from for today's talk. So what is artificial intelligence, right? There's a lot of interest in this quote-unquote new technology, okay? Everybody recognize this image here? Terminator movies. The first 2 were good, then they made about 4 more movies that they maybe didn't need to make. But, when people think of AI, a lot of the hesitation, I think, and kind of fear of the unknown goes to images like this, right? the robots are going to become sentient and they're going to wipe out humanity and it's going to be terrible. Well, I think that's a bit overblown. But I did, in preparation for this talk, ask ChatGPT. How many people, by a show of hands, have used ChatGPT before? Okay, a decent amount. So for those of you that don't know, ChatGPT is a product that's offered by a company called OpenAI, which is based out of Silicon Valley. It's raised like $1 trillion. They've raised billions of dollars, and this is their flagship product. It's basically a chat interface where you can ask it questions, and it will provide you responses. Sometimes it'll give you sources, and you can kind of play around with it to fine-tune the answers that you get, the information, et cetera. I've been using it since November of 2022 when it first became public. But I went to ChatGPT, and the GPT stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer. We don't need to get into the technicalities of kind of what that means. All you need to know is that it's trained on data, which is a whole kind of, and really whenever these AI companies say that they're trained on data, what they're usually talking about is it's trained on the internet. So if you've ever seen any funny stories about ChatGPT or other AI products producing answers like, how do I make I'm making a pizza at home and I want the cheese to stick on it more tightly. And ChatGPT, or I believe it was another product called Claude, said, well, you should use glue when making the pizza. Well, the reason that it responded that way is that it was trained on data on the internet. Specifically, that answer came from a website called Reddit. Some of you may know Reddit. It's not exactly, how shall I say, moderated for its accuracy in information. And so the AI model spit out an answer, oh, you should use glue when making your pizza. But this here was, I asked GPT-4o, which is the newest version of ChatGPT, what is artificial intelligence? And it gave a very kind of academic answer here, right? Artificial intelligence is a branch of computer science focused on creating systems capable of performing tasks that typically require human intelligence. These tasks include learning, reasoning, problem solving, perception, language understanding, and interaction. Typically, AI is categorized in kind of one of three buckets: narrow AI, weak AI. You've probably interacted with narrow AI in many ways that you just don't even necessarily realize. This is AI that's very highly focused on a particular problem set or piece of information, a kind of small domain. There's general AI, which is strong AI. This is more akin to, if anybody remembers DeepMind, the chess-playing artificial intelligence, and I think actually IBM Watson, that played Jeopardy. This is kind of more of that strong AI. It's able to make inferences. It's closer to human intelligence. And then there's this third category, which is just theoretical, which is super intelligent AI, an advanced form of AI that surpasses human intelligence. If you've ever heard anybody talk about a concept called the singularity, this kind of plays into that, right? As soon as we create artificial intelligence that's as smart as us, it will create its own artificial intelligence that will be even more intelligent, et cetera. It goes on and on and on. That's where a lot of the dystopia and kind of fear around AI comes into play. So, as I said, super intelligent AI is theoretical, but underpinning all of these different types of AI are certain techniques that allow them to achieve the results and functionality that they're looking for. So if you've ever heard machine learning, okay, the learning part is related to that training concept where usually there's a lot of human involvement, okay, and it's categorizing data. Data is just information, right? You could create an AI bot that's trained on Chautauqua speakers, right? And you would, with human interaction, categorize the topics. This is about this, and then you could build out basically an artificial speaker on whatever topic based off of that corpus of knowledge, right? Deep learning, which involves neural networks. Neural networks are called as such because it's meant to mimic the brain, the way that our neurons are connected and they kind of fire and information is exchanged. Natural language processing, okay, that's interpreting human language and processing it and giving output. And then computer vision. Does anybody have Teslas in here? What, no Tesla owners, really? Wow, I'm kind of surprised, actually. Maybe, I don't know, our viewpoint is skewed because we live in Chicago and there's Teslas everywhere, right? But self-driving cars utilize computer vision, right? Prior to founding my own law firm, I did a lot of work related to navigation and routing, as well as work related to really all of these different techniques that AI is able to achieve what it is. And so it's been kind of funny the past couple of years, all of this new interest in AI, because this was legal work that I had been doing for almost like a decade, but nobody cared because it was largely behind the walled corporate garden, right? It was stuff that occurred in the background. A lot of medical imaging utilizes AI techniques, neural networks to identify, diagnose, produce better patient outcomes, things like that. But nobody cared, because it was big giant companies like Siemens and Microsoft and everything else were using these technologies, but it didn't have that consumer-facing front, right? It didn't have this interface where you could say, what is artificial intelligence? And it gives you a very thoughtful, interesting answer. Actually here, various different fields like healthcare, finance, transportation, entertainment. But fundamentally, AI is about mimicking human intelligence. And I think the mimicking part is really if you take anything away from today's talk, kind of focusing on that. It's not, I would say, in my opinion, actual intelligence, right? It's mimicking, it's producing an experience as a user of the technology or a beneficiary of the technology's power, something that can feel like intelligence, right? But I personally feel like intelligence is something that, starts getting into philosophical kind of religious questions, right? And I don't know that I don't believe, perhaps even in my kid's lifetime, that we're going to get to a point where we're able to kind of unlock wisdom, right? AI may be able to tell you all sorts of facts. It may be able to help you solve engineering problems, things of that nature. But is it going to tell you, a lucid answer on how to live a good life? I don't know. I'm not convinced. There's a lot of very smart people who've made a lot of money or are going to make a lot of money that think that this is definitely a solvable problem. I don't know. I guess I kind of feel like God hides in the cracks, and I think human intelligence is no different. So, as I said, this is about mimicking. And on that mimicking point, AI is really not a new phenomenon. Just as I shared with you, my own work experience, this is something people have been dealing with for a long time, okay? Has anyone ever seen this image before? No? Okay, well, you're in luck. You're going to learn something new. This is called the Mechanical Turk, okay? So what this was an automatic chess player that was popular in Europe, 1770, and it appeared to play a strong game of chess against a human opponent. Well, as you can see from the image, there it was, I guess I should have had a laser pointer, but there was a person inside this little box that was actually playing chess, but it fooled people for decades, right? Until the game was up. It was called the Mechanical Turk. How about this image? Anybody recognize this fellow? Yes? Alan Turing, that's right, the father of computer science, also kind of the father of artificial intelligence. He came up with something, kind of a hypothetical question, I guess, called the Turing test, right? And it was this idea that if you had a person on one side of a screen and they were interacting with the screen, asking it questions, it was responding, the point at which the person asking the questions to the screen, to the computer, that they did not know whether or not they were dealing with a human being or a computer, if you created a program that was able to do that, to trick the person, to make them think they were interacting with a human being, then it was said that the computer had passed the Turing test, right? Incidentally, when ChatGPT first came out and it was very popular and everything, I went there and started asking it very hyper-specific questions that I knew the answer to as a specialist in my own fields or whatever, and it wasn't able to produce cogent answers. It was there, or the answers were incorrect. I tried to break it. I mean, I have a degree in computer science. That's just, you know, I tinker. That's what I do. But what ChatGPT and a lot of these AI tools are really good at is when you're kind of outside your field of expertise. So maybe you have like a general question. Maybe you want to know about late modern Japanese history, and you don't really know much about it. Well, it'll produce a really good answer for you, right? But since you're not an expert or specialist in the field, it's hard for you to know whether or not the information is 100% accurate, right? So again, this is really not new technology. It's just kind of newly packaged, let's say. Here again is ChatGPT. Tell me about the history of artificial intelligence. You know, ancient myths of kind of, I think you can find writings from the ancient Greeks about kind of animals that act like human beings, machines that act like human beings. But really it starts with Alan Turing, okay? He was the first one that kind of started putting pen to paper and kind of ways that you could think about intelligence and how you could try and embody it in a computer. There was the term actually came from a conference at Dartmouth in 1956, and all of the early research was focused on symbolic reasoning and problem solving, okay? There was a big boom in the 70s and 80s. Maybe you've heard the term expert systems. Right around that time, there was a lot of focus on developing expert systems, whether it was in law or in medicine or other areas of that nature. My mentor in law school, he actually did a ton of work on expert systems in the 80s and kind of found that it was useful, but it wasn't going to kind of transcend to that next human level intelligence. You know, it was really good at specific problems if you define the problem very well for the tooling to give you answers that were useful for whatever means, but it wasn't kind of, it couldn't go beyond that. The way I kind of think of AI, if we go back to this definition here, you know, if we're going to get super intelligent AI, it needs to be able to answer that question about, you know, modern Japanese history, then, you know, take its robot body, hop on a bicycle, ride its bicycle to a restaurant, work as a sous chef, and then go home and start playing the piano. You know, that's what a human being could do. A human being could do all of those things, right? Right, but AI is not there yet for a variety of reasons. So AI may not be new, but these recent versions of AI are different from past iterations. Why is that? Well, there's kind of three reasons for this. One, we have access to way more computational power and just kind of horsepower in computing than we ever did before. How many, you know, if any of you invested in NVIDIA in the past couple of years, you may have seen tremendous gains. Well, that's because AI researchers and AI companies a few years ago realized that they could use the particular kind of computer chips that NVIDIA produces at scale, graphics, they're called GPUs, graphics processing units, because that was kind of like the most horsepower intensive type of computing in the past, and they realized they could use those GPUs for AI-specific problems. NVIDIA has now since kind of like is a $1 trillion company. It's on track to being, you know, the biggest company in the world, basically. So that's one reason, right? More computational horsepower than we ever had before. The next reason is more access to data sets, right? At the very beginning I said, all of these AI models are trained on the internet, right? Well, there's an old problem in computing, if you have garbage in, you get garbage out, right? And that goes back to Charles Babbage, even previous, late 19th century, pre-Alan Turing. And that's how you end up with answers like, well, you should put glue on your pizza to keep the cheese on, right? But there is more data simply out there, and the ability to kind of scrape all of that data and feed it into these models to quote unquote learn and train is something that just wasn't accessible previously, right? Cloud computing factors into all of this. Incidentally, OpenAI, which builds ChatGPT, is being sued by like 25 different companies because those companies are saying they illegally scraped all of their data. The New York Times is suing them. The big book publishers are suing them. All of those cases are pending and probably will result in very large settlements, I would think, which is unfortunate as a lawyer because I would prefer they actually go to trial and we get some decisions out of them so we kind of have an idea of where the boundaries are going to be with respect to these sorts of activities and how AI operates. But then there was also innovation in the way that AI interprets data. Without getting too much into the weeds, that transformer, the generative pre-trained transformer, that GPT part of ChatGPT, that refers to transformer technology, which was invented by Google in 2016, 2017. And basically what they do is they kind of tokenize pieces of information. So like discrete, you think of it, if you remember your grammar exercises where you kind of had to map out the sentence, in every particular, it's akin to that, except data being tokenized in a way that then, these internal kind of models can make sense out of it, right? So when you're asking questions of ChatGPT or other kind of AI models, when it's feeding you back an answer, it's basically guessing what the next most likely logical word should be in the answer that it gives you, right? So if it catches history, it knows, okay, well, I need to look in my pre-trained data set for everything related to history. Anything that's been kind of tagged in that regard. Oh, Japanese history? Okay, everything related to Japan, right? So it's much more likely to then give you information that's relevant to your question. So those three developments kind of combined together is what has kind of brought us to this point. So, what are some of the, legal developments in the US at the moment? Well, much of the focus has been at the federal level, okay? This is from last year. Senator Chuck Schumer from New York launched this major effort to get ahead of artificial intelligence. I know that there was a speaker here yesterday, a political science professor, who was talking about the geopolitics of AI. This is not only just a kind of tech innovation question here in the United States, it's also a geopolitical problem, in part, at least from the US government's eyes. They don't want China to win AI, right? Whatever win means there in that context. So Schumer launched this effort last year. It was driven in part because of the explosion in the development of generative AI systems, of which ChatGPT is one. It spurred alarm among lawmakers and the broader public about AI's potential social, economic, and security ramifications. Federal government has made some early moves, including the Commerce Department, to create AI safety rules. So that's kind of I wouldn't say it's controversial, but that's a growing new field, is how do we develop these systems so that they are, they minimize bias in the answers that they produce, but then they also don't necessarily produce answers that could be dangerous, right? For example, if I were to ask ChatGPT how to build a nuclear bomb, we don't want it to give me an answer, I would think, right? Similarly, other kind of dangerous activities, they want to train these systems so that they don't enable or make it easier for people to do bad things, right? This is just talking a bit about kind of trying to figure out a framework, with industry input, so that the U.S. can position itself to take advantage of the technology. But how do we develop these sorts of resilient regulations that balance the need for security, accountability, and transparency with facilitating innovation? And I deal with this every single day with my clients. They're by and large fairly well capitalized technology startups. They have interesting ideas. They're all convinced they're going to change the world. Some of them will, most of them will fail. But these sorts of regulatory frameworks can be kind of business killing for them if they're overly onerous, right? If they're just so burdensome that it's just too difficult for them to figure out how to make money and also be in compliance with the law. Much of these regulations are going to be focused on identification of who trained the algorithm, who the intended audience is, disclosure of data sources, explanation for how it arrives at its responses, and transparent and strong ethical boundaries. Now, what's difficult here, and kind of like some of the resistance from industry, is that they just want to move as fast as they can, right? They want to produce they want systems that produce as accurate as possible answers, as quickly as possible, and are as multi-purpose so that they can grab as much market share as possible. So all of these 4 points are solvable problems for industry, but it slows down how fast they can move, right? They have to change the way they function as a business, and that's why there's kind of pushback. There's a lot of kind of working groups that have been stood up at the federal level, people that are interested, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, the National Institute for Standards and Technology. They're all kind of working on trying to figure out what sort of guardrails need to be in place. Just this year, a couple months ago, there was Schumer's kind of working group or whatnot put out this Driving U.S. Innovation in Artificial Intelligence, a roadmap for AI policy in the U.S., okay? And you can see from the kind of headings here, just a little intro, the road ahead. We want to support U.S. innovation in AI, AI in the workforce, high impact uses of AI. There's a lot of fear, and we're in an election season. I don't know if you guys knew that. But there's a lot of fear of, what sort of impact is AI going to have on our elections, right? There's very genuine, real fear related to deep fakes. I don't know if you've heard of these, but basically AI-generated images and video of events that never happened, right? And can that sway elections? Some states have passed, Minnesota passed a law, I believe last year, that made it, I think, criminal if you published a deep fake within 60 days of an election or something that was intended to try and sway the result. There's also really bad, actors that are using AI video and whatnot to, portray people in very negative lights and doing very inappropriate things. Should that be something that, carries its own separate kind of criminal liability? Do the laws in the books already kind of cover this behavior? These are the open questions. Privacy and liability, how do we deal with transparency, explainability of AI? What about intellectual property? I'm a registered patent attorney. About half of my book of business is IP issues, right? If the AI is able to just kind of steal protected information and produce new information on that, what happens? The Patent Office and the US Copyright Office actually moved very early with respect to AI because we want to drive innovation, and engineers and computer types are going to use AI, but we have laws that protect human innovation. Do we want to protect AI-driven innovation? And how do we do that, right? I gave a talk earlier this year in February at SMU down in Dallas, all about AI-driven innovation and kind of how do you strike that right balance, especially because the kind of big irony of this, or one of the narrative threads of all this, is that AI was going to take away jobs. It's going to, the economy is going to grow, but people are going to have to do less. And the Silicon Valley types were, especially the AI people, were like, oh, well, we should have universal basic income because it's going to kill all of these jobs and then people won't be able to work. Well, some of the very first jobs that AI is taking are software engineering jobs. And it's kind of like, no, not those jobs. We meant the other jobs, not the high value jobs that we have. We want the other jobs. Safeguarding against AI risks, national security concerns. There was a fascinating, tragic, and kind of crazy story about a man that worked at one of the major banks, I think it may have been HSBC, who initiated a $25 million wire transfer after he had a conversation with what he thought was the internal kind of finance team at the bank via video calls, and everyone on that call was a deep fake video. And he had been socially engineered to transfer this money to scammers, and he had no idea. Now, there's probably more to the story there, and he probably did not necessarily follow proper protocol or whatnot, but these things are already happening. You can look that up. It's like a 30-page document. Obviously, it's pretty dense, but if you're interested. Just kind of going through some of the other policy priorities that we haven't necessarily talked about. Deepfakes related to election content, ways to ensure higher education institutions and companies of all sizes can compete in AI innovation. Personally, I think that one of the really promising areas for AI tools like ChatGPT, et cetera, is an idea of like personalized tutors. Okay, so just at a scale and for a cost much lower than we could have ever dreamed of previously, my kids could have tutors on any subject, right? And you could just have an AI model that is trained on, biology, chemistry, or whatever, and it can be interactive, and it can be very much like a human-to-human tutoring experience. There's an interesting company called Khan Academy, and they have an AI bot called Conmigo that does exactly this, right? I think we're going to see a lot more of that. I have a friend who is a principal in Chicago Public School Systems. He actually spoke on Monday via video, and he's really interested in how can we use AI just off the shelf, commercial offerings that aren't even necessarily cost prohibitive, but how can we use it to improve educational outcomes? But again, there's all these risks. How do you encourage a conscientious consideration of the impact AI will have on our workforce, and potential job displacement, et cetera. But, kind of why is all this happening, right? And I think it's important to ask this question and kind of give it some serious thought. And my leading theory is based on a couple of things here. So in October of last year, there was an executive order on the safe and secure and trustworthy development and use of artificial intelligence. I think it's the longest executive order a presidential office has ever issued. It's like 110 pages. It's basically like a master's thesis on AI, okay? And it gets into really nitty-gritty details of what should be allowed, what the federal government wants to encourage, what they don't want to encourage. You can purpose extraordinary potential for both promise and peril, right? There's all sorts of things that we could solve, but also, it could make societal harms even worse, such as fraud, discrimination, bias, and disinformation. So the Biden administration, consequently the federal government, has been strongly motivated to get ahead of AI and make sure the appropriate guardrails are in place for its development. And it's not just the government that wants to get AI right. I don't know how many people remember last year in March, there was 1,000 tech leaders that signed an open letter to put a pause, a 6-month pause on the development of AI tools because they were worried about not getting things right, and all of a sudden we end up with this, right? So, hey, we need to hit pause for 6 months. Incidentally, nobody paused. Everybody just kept developing. The letter did nothing, and the world didn't end, okay? I'm kind of, despite the fact that I deal with, hyper-technical people on a regular basis, I'm somewhat in the minority in thinking that we're not going to create the machine God. It's not going to happen. I don't think. I'm willing to bet on that. People think I'm naive, but I think they're naive. So, with respect to the government, there is a desire to avoid, with AI, to avoid the mistakes made with social media. I think that the 2016 election specifically somewhat broke the brain of policymakers in DC when it comes to technology. They didn't really expect social media to have the impact that it did, and then it did. And so ever since then, they're very distrustful of anything coming out of Silicon Valley, right? And this is understandable, but the technologies are very different. Social media can be a force multiplier of individual influence. Same with artificial intelligence, right? I use ChatGPT in a way akin to a colleague, that I would walk down the hallway and just bounce ideas off. I use it as a writing aid, okay? It helps me get up to speed on topics and kind of enjoy that force multiplier effect. It can also be a force multiplier of individual organizations, right? But that's where the similarities kind of stop between social media and AI. Social media is centrally administered. AI doesn't need to be. You can go on the internet and you can get these ChatGPT-like models, and you can download them on your laptop, or and you can create your own little AI bots and tooling and everything else. Social media, the effects of social media originated online. AI, it doesn't need to innovate online. The effects of it can be implemented in industrial systems and factories. The power grid uses a lot of AI tools to transfer load and make sure that people are getting power that need it. Social media made the world flatter, it lowered the barriers for communication. AI is really going to lower the barriers for innovation, right? In part because of what I was saying earlier, how people are just able to get up to speed on a topic much quicker than they were previously. But I think the good thing is that people are already using AI in disputes and in business, right? Which impacts the law. So just some examples. A lot of these things are not new, right? Like I said earlier, all of this kind of interest and hype is just funny to me because this is stuff that people had been doing, mostly in corporate America for a long time. There's online dispute resolution. There's legal analytics and prediction. My co-professor that I teach that class with at Chicago Kent College of Law, him and some colleagues built a tool to predict Supreme Court decisions. Basically, they took all of the decisions of all the justices that are on the Supreme Court, they fed it into a model, and then they were able to predict with really high degree of accuracy how individual justices would rule in cases moving forward. Dan also his current company that he's working on right now, actually they built an AI model that passed the bar exam. I don't think that AI is going to replace lawyers anytime soon. I hope not. And if it is, hopefully not me. I think I maybe have a competitive advantage given my technical background. But we'll see, right? Document analysis and e-discovery, contract analysis and management, sentiment and emotion analysis, as well as enhanced decision-making, fraud detection and prevention, customer service and support, regulatory compliance. But the danger in all of those kind of ways that we're already using AI is we can't replace human judgment and wisdom with AI outputs. You just can't do it. Over-reliance on the tool, on any tool, is always a problem. So it should be a supplemental tool. One of the things that I learned when I first started working with neural networks in medical imaging, focused on innovation there, is that you get much better patient outcomes where it's a doctor and an AI tool working together, right? Markedly better. There's whole bodies of research kind of verifying that, right, and establishing that as a kind of a rule. People are already using AI in business. This is from a Forbes article. All business owners, 97% of business owners believe ChatGPT will help their business. I don't know if that's necessarily true. 1 in 3 businesses plan to use it to write website content, that's for sure. You know, while concerns exist, the technology dependence and potential workforce reduction, most business owners foresee a positive impact from AI implementation, right? The market size is expected to just explode. ChatGPT had 1 million users within the first 5 days of being available. I'm not sure how many users it has, but the peril in businesses, right? We get even more misinformation. I mean, if you think there's a lot of garbage content on the internet, it's just going to get worse, right? We're going to have an absolute deluge of this content that's just all AI generated, right? I mean, I already get tons of marketing emails that are clearly AI generated, and people are starting to refer to it as slop, you know, because it's just, it looks, you know, upon first blush that it's useful information, and then you kind of dig into it and you're like, this is not actually useful. People in government are very interested. There's lots of activity. Lawyers, despite the fact that generally we're kind of slow on the uptick when it comes to technology, have been very forward thinking. There's been lots of groups stood up. Courts are concerned. This is from the American Bar Association website of state AI task forces that are investigating, you know, what, if anything, should be done. California, Florida, Illinois, Kentucky, Minnesota, New York, Texas. There may be more now. Here's from the National Center for State Courts, just additional task forces that have been stood up. I am on the Illinois Supreme Court task force on what to do about generative AI. There's 20 of us there. You know, it's been a very interesting experience because despite being probably the most junior person in the task force, everyone has been very thoughtful, and the judges that are in that task force definitely want to use AI, but there's a kind of tension between, well, do the rules of conduct that we have for judges or the rules of professional responsibility we have for lawyers in the state of Illinois, does it already cover this, right? Is it inclusive enough to cover the use of artificial intelligence? You know, the question is really how. How are people going to be using it? You know, the work of the task force will produce a report, and it'll come out in the fall. I've been strongly pushing for some sort of rule or at least a comment in place explicitly stating that we will not replace human judgment with that of artificial intelligence. Shockingly, there has been pushback on that. I mean, I thought that would be like a good line in the sand that I could win. And people are kind of, well, we don't want to tell judges what to do and that. And, you know, of course, I don't really feel it's my place to like convince all of these, you know, much more senior people than myself that they're wrong. But we'll see. Maybe I'll find a way to kind of work it into the report when it gets published. Ohio is looking into AI. I just found this out getting ready for the talk here. December, the lieutenant governor announced a release of a policy governing the use of AI within state government, right? I'm always pushing my clients like, hey, try and get government contracts. Governments pay on time, they pay in full, they pay regularly. You know, they're not going anywhere anytime soon. They're great clients. Of course, that's not as sexy as what they think they want to do, so nobody has taken me up on that. But it's good to see, you know, a very large state like Ohio and Illinois, you know, thinking about this. This is kind of their governance framework, which makes sense. They have a council at the top here. You know, legal, of course, is right up there. You know, how agency leadership, you know, how are they going to develop things? And in the base, importantly, is this kind of principles. Are these fair tools that we're using? Are they accountable? Are they secure, right? Is it transparent? Is it ethical? But ultimately, this federal effort is going to drive a lot of the regulation because AI companies and big tech, they prefer this kind of federal action versus 50 different states that they have to deal with, right? There's good things and bad things about that, right? You can have regulatory capture where basically whatever Google and Microsoft says should happen, is it going to happen? Is it going to be good for Google and Microsoft? Yes. Is it going to be good for small clients and small businesses that I represent? No. So new technology will lead to new laws, but it will take time. So I'm happy to take any questions. As I said, my hope is to kind of maybe take the temperature down a bit with respect to AI and make it seem like a more manageable problem and something that anybody can really understand. So happy to take any and all questions. And John's walking around with my, and
I'm right here.
somebody else.
Hi.
Hi. In terms of the U.S. government's efforts to institute controls on AI, how are we in comparison to other Western nations across the world? And the second part of the question is, with the current extreme polarization of the U.S. Congress, how is that affecting efforts to control AI?
That's a great two-part question there. Are you a lawyer? No, but I think, so the EU passed basically an AI framework, the European Union, earlier this year, maybe the end of last year. And, it's, I would say that the US is leading the way in terms of innovation and perhaps is a bit slower with respect to how we intend to regulate these companies and these kind of the new technology. The EU kind of, I think, jumped the gun in the sense that they passed this huge framework meant to govern this kind of new technology, which is not new, prior to us really knowing what impact this kind of generative AI, et cetera, is going to have on society. Also, there aren't really any AI companies that are headquartered in the EU. I mean, you can make of that what you will, right? There's one called Anthropic, which is in the United Kingdom. But, the United Kingdom's not in the EU, right? I think that we're taking our time and are focused on kind of like the innovation and developing the technology itself. Now, the geopolitical consideration and kind of fear of what China is doing on that front is forcing the federal government's hand more so than it would be if China was not already making tremendous kind of development of AI. Now, I would say that, and I don't think it's controversial, the development of AI in China is largely related to controlling the population and kind of managing their system and everything else. So that's not exactly a good thing, right? And then, what was the second? Now I forgot the second part of your question.
Geopolitical polarization.
The polarization. Will that lead to anything getting done? Well, that's an interesting question. I think that to a certain extent, regardless of party, politicians are skeptical of big tech, which I think AI and big tech kind of go hand in hand, right? OpenAI, their biggest investor is Microsoft, So it's not Microsoft proper, but Microsoft, invested over $1 billion in the company, right? So it's a startup, but it's one that's of a flavor that's like Microsoft and Google, right? Google has their own AI kind of ChatGPT-like product as well. And incidentally, former President Trump, announced his running mate, Senator J.D. Vance, right? And he is really focused on kind of trying to enable what you might call little tech, right? So if we get a regulatory framework focused on the technology in place, and say there's a second Trump administration, my suspicion is that they would try and temper the power of Microsoft and Google with respect to this technology, and try and enable more startups and everything else, to innovate in that space. So I think it would probably be more of a light touch regulation, but it will be very much driven by who wins in November, I think.
Thanks for a very interesting talk. My question is to run the film fast forward, let's say 50 years. And what has happened here is like a tsunami hitting a bunch of people on the beach. This has happened much faster than was predicted by technology observers. Although Norbert Wiener in 1948 warned us, when it becomes sentient, we have no good reason to believe it will be kindly disposed to us, quote unquote.
Right.
So here we are. My question is this. You're a lawyer. We're basically citizens. To what extent should democracy be engaged in building a firewall between where we are as humans controlled and where we lose control? And the lose control is an interesting question. People like Stephen Hawking, even Elon Musk, say it's only a matter of time before it takes over. And it will think of us like we think of our toasters. It'll have no kind regards for us. All of us in the room here, I presume, are human. And we've had stubbed toes, broken hearts, pet dogs and cats, and emotions. We cry. It is not carbon-based intelligence. It is silicon-based intelligence.
Right.
It will have had none of those experiences. So the question is this, and this is really an unfair question to you, but I want to ask it anyway. How do we democratically build a firewall against this technology that's coming so fast and is so profitable, and it is part of a geopolitical system? If we don't do it, the Chinese will do it, blah, blah, blah. So what is the role of democracy? And the last thing I'd say is this. In thinking about that firewall and the issues at stake, I doubt that anybody in this room would willingly get in a car if they knew it had a 50-50 chance of a fatal accident. Stephen Hawking says it's virtually certain. Elon Musk believes it's virtually certain, not 50%, but certain, that this will end badly for humans. Great for machines, bad for humans. So the question is, and it's a big, fuzzy, unanswerable question, but reflect a little bit, if you would, on how democracy comes to play in this situation where the odds are pretty good we could very well lose control. Do we have a vote? Do we have a say?
Yeah, I mean, that's the big question, right? And I think that the way that you think about the question and the way that you answer the question says more about the individual person and kind of how they view the world, how they view human intelligence, human life, existence, really just life in general. If AI becomes sentient, I think it's a big assumption on our part that it would be anything like human beings, right? I think it's also an assumption that it would be negative. You know, I mean, I'm a huge sci-fi nerd, right? I think that if human beings are going to become a spacefaring, species, we will need AI. And maybe we'll need AI that's at that sentient-like level, right? Because it'll be able to solve problems much quicker than we can. It's kind of, Steve Jobs said that a computer is like a bicycle of the mind, right? It allows you to do things that you couldn't do before. So I'm hopeful, perhaps that's kind of like the naive optimist in me, that there is a path forward that's beneficial. But with respect to democracy and our kind of like system of government, and let's just say, Western democracies, what, if anything, can we do on the political front to kind of have that firewall? There's a really interesting article that was in Smithsonian Magazine, I believe, from a couple of years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And it sort of addressed this question of what will it be like when AI is everywhere? And it's 5 different stories, right? They spoke with experts that work in the field of kind of where they thought things would be in like 50 years, 25 years, something like that. And one of the stories was on AI becoming sentient of a type and then suing for its right to vote, right to be represented, and kind of all of these other rights that we have, and it goes all the way up to the Supreme Court in this kind of story. Now, do I think that's possible? I mean, sure, right? Is it possible that all of this goes horribly awry? Yes, it's possible. Do I think it's likely? No. Am I willing to kind of bet against it? Yeah, I guess I am. So I don't know, you know, I think we're kind of seeing how democracy could already build that firewall play out right now. You know, the EU, despite I said, you know, they kind of put the cart before the horse, putting in place their framework. That is one way in which democracy kind of is trying to construct a firewall. You know, but if it's going to be a different type of life itself, you know, what digital in nature, I don't really know what that looks like, you know, and I don't know how our human institutions, which are very flexible and kind of more analog, right? It's very loosey-goosey and wave. You know, computers are discrete. They're digital. You know, it's zeros and ones. They're only able to kind of exist in that discrete environment. And so I don't know. It's a great question, and I've definitely not answered it. But I like the Norbert Wiener reference. That was very good.
I noticed that you said you were the junior member on the group. Do you feel that the possibility of many of our government bigwigs, like Schumer was, I feel that he's ahead of a whole lot of people that he has to deal with. Is the lack of knowledge of what's happened at the level of the age of some of the people that are in charge of our government a hindrance in us coming up with an answer to these questions?
I do think it's a hindrance, not necessarily because of, well, I think it's a hindrance because of the lack of knowledge, because it's difficult, I think, for policymakers to quickly ascertain fact from fiction, right? So much of this is kind of marketing hype and everything else. And an interesting kind of consequence, I would say, of maybe the past couple of years that's really been exacerbated by this interest in AI is that, you know, people in DC are somewhat deferring to Silicon Valley, and yet all of the Silicon Valley people, you know, think that San Francisco, which is their mecca, so to speak, right, is ungovernable, and it's, you know, it's being overrun, and it's a terrible place. And it's like, well, why are we taking cues from people that can't even get their own backyard in order, so to speak? You know, you don't see Silicon Valley VCs running for office in California. You know, they're happy to complain about, you know, everything else. So, you know, I don't think it is a lack of knowledge, but it's not a lack of ability to learn the knowledge, if that makes sense. Yeah, you can. Anyone in this room can learn as much as you want about it. Trust me. It may have, you know, kind of clouded jargon and everything else, but that's all nonsense. I mean, programmers and lawyers, they like to put on these airs and everything else. Only we can know the secrets of the universe, and that's crap.
So, looking at the uses of AI, you know, the most recent ransomware attack on our healthcare system, that had a vast impact on a lot of people. And, you know, United Healthcare is underestimated by $1 billion how much that attack is going to cost the company. What can we do with AI to number one, prevent that, and number two, penalize the people that do that?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's my biggest complaint, right? These guys that did that, they're sitting in Russia, and there's no repercussions to what they've done. How can we use AI to keep it from happening and to make it such that there's too high of a price to pay for that to happen?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we kind of need a restructuring of software development to be much more security first oriented. You know, when I got my degree in computer science, that, you know, the security of the systems that we were developing or learning about was kind of an afterthought. Now I didn't work in mission critical type stuff, but there are industries that are mission critical, right? Airplanes are not falling from the sky, and there's a reason for that, right? It's because there's lots of redundancy. Now, of course, with all the news with Boeing over the past few months, maybe that's not a great example, but there are ways to develop technology that's dependent upon software that is security focused first, right? Not just go to market first, not just, how do we make the most money possible, okay? So I think that's part of it, right, is kind of a changing in the way that we think about development of systems, and AI can help that, right? It can just review things way faster than teams of human beings can. It can find problems. I've worked on a lot of financial technology over the years for big exchanges previously, when I worked for somebody else, and they were already using AI-like systems to detect fraud in their in their systems, but there was a financial incentive for that, right? If there isn't a financial incentive, then people can get kind of lazy. With respect to ransomware, especially originating out of Russia or North Korea, I mean, most of the North Korean government is funded in part from hacking, right? Their nuclear program is funded largely because of hacks. And so, I don't think that our kind of 20th century governmental institutions, which are really more like 19th century governmental institutions in the developed world, are built to be quick enough and reactive enough to kind of change things. The law should, generally speaking, kind of lag technology, but it's becoming increasingly apparent, I think, your question is a good example of that it's lagging a little too much, and things just need to happen a little quicker because of everything accelerating, et cetera.
Okay, so we were talking about this 50% chance that things will go wrong, and that Musk made a comment to that effect. Well, he says a lot of things, but one of the things that stuck in my mind that he said was he thinks that it's 99% probable that we're living in a simulation today, which means we are the end result of all that. I just thought maybe you might have a few comments on the simulation theory.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, and I think that a lot of very smart people like Musk and others think that that's what's going on. And one answer is kind of, well, who cares? What difference does it make, right? If we can't know for certain, and it's a big mystery of life, then does it make, is it going to make you, if that were true and you knew that, would you live your life any differently? Would you still, I assume you would still try and be a good person day to day, Some people may be impacted differently, right, if that came out to be the case. But I also think that, engineers tend to think that they can model anything, and and this is part of why I think, the AI superintelligence or whatever that's going to take over is not that likely, is because I don't know that some of these things can really be accurately modeled. Now, are we going to be able to develop, robots that act human-like? Yes, I think for sure, right? We already have to a certain degree. Will they become very convincing? Yes. Will they actually be intelligent and, kind of have a soul? I don't think so. And that's kind of why I said earlier, I do think that, just because science can produce answers, we keep going deeper and deeper, and God hides in the cracks if you believe in God, right? I don't think we're ever going to, and kind of, I think it gets to that digital versus analog divide, right? Life and existence is analog. It's all waves and things like that. It's not discrete zeros and ones. I don't think, personally, I don't believe in a digital universe, I guess. There's just lots of questions. This is great.
I understand that one of the complex problems with AI evolving now is incorporating values and ethics into it to actually make the software be moral and do the right thing. What's the current status of that? How's that going?
I think it's a mixed bag thus far. I think it's mostly been an academic exercise. Now, that's not entirely true. There were a bunch of people that resigned from OpenAI last year in protest because they felt that the internal kind of policies and principles that have been put in place to try and safely develop the technology were not being followed and they were being violated. I think that it's difficult, especially in our day and age where we have these multinational technology companies, right, that operate in jurisdictions all over the world, and those jurisdictions have different values, and that shouldn't be a controversial thing to say, but it is in certain corners, right? Well, who decides what ethics are the right set of ethics and whatnot? So there's kind of a conflict in academia and in the industry as to, well, are we going to build these systems in accordance with U.S. democratic values? I'm very pro-U.S. I think that would be great. I do think that there's something to be said for Reagan's shining city on the hill. I would much rather have U.S. values built into these AI systems than North Korean values, right? But I'd probably rather have U.S. values built into them than Western European values, or even Japan. So it's not, I think what we'll see kind of in the marketplace is different approaches, and we're starting to already see that somewhat. Musk has an AI tool that is anti-woke or whatever, so you can ask it questions and it'll give you inflammatory answers. But sometimes this stuff goes haywire. Google had there was a viral news story a couple months ago where somebody prompted Google's AI system and it said, produce pictures of America's founding fathers. And there was not one white man in the output. Well, that's just not accurate, right? I mean, we know what the founding fathers look like, and it was, a diverse set of people or everything else. And, I think part of the issue is kind of what I was saying earlier. Silicon Valley is kind of leading the way in terms of technical innovation, but there's not as much focus on kind of the classical liberal arts education part of it, right? And even though these systems are flashy and they're able to produce amazing results and experiences and everything else, there's not enough theater majors in the room to a certain extent.
My understanding is that AI is based on large data sets.
Yes.
And there are several data sets being compiled by American organizations, and I assume, for example, that similar efforts are being made in China and in Russia. I would guess that their data systems will contain very different data than ours do. So what kind of a world is it where what the answer to the question depends on who's asking it, but based on these different data systems that are based on different values. How will we be able to continue to talk with each other?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's yeah, to a certain extent. I mean, it's kind of how things are anyway, right? I think it's I suppose if you read enough sci-fi, I guess this kind of bears it out, but perhaps we're trending towards some sort of monoculture, right? And maybe that monoculture is kind of brought out by the dominance of these tech companies. But I don't, people like to think that the internet is borderless and everything else, and that's just not true, right? It's very geographically limited. I mean, China is an excellent example of Their internet experience is entirely different. You know, you can't, I guarantee you can't ask an AI system in China for images of Tiananmen Square. It just won't produce it, right? You probably would get in trouble even asking the question, okay? Now maybe you'd have some leeway if you're a Western visitor or whatever, but I wouldn't. I'm gonna give you legal advice and say don't try that at home. So I think to a certain extent that's kind of how things already are, different cultures and everything else. But technology is somewhat driving more harmonization, I think, of cultural values, for better or worse. Not sure if that's like a good answer to your question, but.
I have a more nuts and bolts question. There was an article this past year about an attorney who did a legal brief, and apparently it quoted cases that never existed, but was very supportive of his legal position. And so my question is two parts. Number one, how did it fabricate something that never existed in a legal brief? And number two, since artificial intelligence is gathering billions of pieces of data, how do they go about correcting errors like this? Do they re-glean, or do they have a way of overriding? I don't know the procedure on how they would correct things.
Yeah, so for those that don't know, there was a New York State licensed attorney who submitted a brief in a lawsuit and included citations to cases that didn't exist. I think it was like 3 different cases or something. And what had happened is he had used ChatGPT in a hurry, okay, and it drafted the brief for him, and it looked good, and it supported his position. So he claimed, in his disciplinary hearing that came up afterwards, that he just assumed that the output was correct and that it was drawing from real things, and he didn't check the work, right? But this goes to what I was talking about earlier, being on that task force. There is a belief that, the rules of professional responsibility for lawyers already kind of cover a lot of these scenarios. Everything you sign off on as a lawyer, if somebody else is preparing the work for you, it's assumed that you're checking it and that you're putting your license on the line, right? So that case really put the fear of God in all lawyers in the country because it was so widespread and every lawyer knows about that, right? So I think just from a social pressure standpoint, attorneys know, like, okay, I can't just trust it blindly, right? What will be difficult, though, is a lot of the legal the technology tools that law firms use and everything else. It's only a matter of time for AI to get more and more integrated into those tools that they're already using. Even into Microsoft Word, autocorrect is a form of AI when you look at it from a certain view, right? So, I think I'm less concerned about that. There is a serious problem, though, with respect to how do these systems improve over time. And part of that problem is driven by the fact that they don't actually have memory like you and I do, right? And how do you, what we were talking about earlier, how do you engineer a technical solution that functionally acts like memory? I actually have a client who they're building basically business software that's AI enabled that is trying to solve this problem, right? Where it's going to remember past queries and everything else, and the legal questions there are related to, sufficient notice and disclosure to clients that use, to customers that use the technology, but also, how do you respect privacy? How do you all these things that we were talking about earlier in there? And so I think until that sort of memory solution becomes widespread and is not computationally intensive, that it slows people down. Remember, speed is paramount. So until there's solutions that are able to have those sorts of outcomes, you're going to have these problems continue happen.
Okay, and one last question.
Okay.
I'd like to go back to the security issue, these massive intrusions into our systems that cost a lot of people money and other damage. Given the nature of what we're talking about here and broadly in the computer world, it seems to me that there is no way on earth that you could stop any of it, because we just don't know what the permutations, the unlimited permutations that are out there, and the human mind that can, once it focuses on what it wants to do, it's going to accomplish. That person or that group is going to accomplish. Is that a stupid thing to say, or is that?
No, I don't think that's stupid at all. I mean, I think that we're, kind of going back to social media earlier that we talked about, I think we're just in a new paradigm of humanity, so to speak, where now the internet didn't really come into its own until everybody got addicted to smartphones. So, when the iPhone came out in 2007 or whatever, around that time, right? And I think that, like I said earlier, there's not enough theater majors in these rooms that are making, helping kind of guide these technical decisions. It's very much a question of, when you send an engineer in a problem, they want to fix it, right? The consequences be damned, they're going to come up with a solution, okay? And if it works, right? But I do think that in this new paradigm, a lot of the values of a classical education, of critical thinking, focusing on wisdom, what's timeless, regardless, because this is not the first technology revolution that human beings have gone through, right? We've been through massive cycles in the past, and there's always disruption and kind of like a reordering of society. One thing that we talk about in the law school class that I teach, which is focused on blockchain and cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, things like that, is that fundamentally this is a new type of coordination technology, right? And every time in history where there's been new coordination technology, there's new economic activity, there's new types of businesses, there's new things, and society adapts, right? I don't think that AI is any different in that regard. I think that what is different is that information production is reaching a level that we've never dealt with. It's basically like the printing press on steroids with a hyperspace Star Wars drive in it. And so, but I think we can take solace in kind of our humanness, in the sense of like, well, I know I have the capability to critically think and evaluate information. Just because there's more of it doesn't take that away from you. I think where people run into problems is what we were talking about earlier, over-reliance on technology. The lawyer who's in a hurry and he just, oh, well, the brief was produced in 15 minutes. That's great. I'll just file it with the judge and not read it. Obviously, bad things happen that way.
Thank you very much, Nelson. Thank you.
Thank you.